This is Policy, Finance, and Culture, and it's for Zero Net Cities. I want to focus on a couple of parts of this, and really the policy part is where I'm going to start. I mean, why are we even here? Why are we talking about this issue? We're talking about this issue, I think, because on the part of Americans, I believe that we as a people want clean, reliable, and affordable energy. Clean meaning we want the most environmentally sound energy that can be delivered us in a secure and a reliable way, and we want it at prices that people across the spectrum can afford. And there's a variety of different ways of trying to get there to do this. But this place of NetZero Cities, or Zero Net, I said Zero Net Cities to my wife on the way out, and she goes, that means when one city goes away, another one has to come? Is that? And I said, I've got this little bit of dyslexia that crops up early in the morning. So for NetZero Cities, it's one place. But I'm going to put this in the context of some larger things, and Mari introduced it to some extent by talking about what we're working at, about why it's this really important place for municipalities or counties or small towns, really to think about the role that they occupy in trying to develop a different sort of energy systems and a system within systems. Let's first talk about sort of how we make policy in America. We do it at the federal level, through the United States Congress and through regulatory policy. We do it at the state level, again, state legislators, regulators, a variety of agencies that may be involved in rulemaking. And then we do it at the local level. And at the local level, there's a variety of things that might intersect with those other areas, with state and federal, but you can do a great deal at the local level, actually, that complements or even is its own design. So let's start with the federal level in Congress. You know how much energy legislation the United States Congress has passed in the last 2 years? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Zippo. Zero. The big donut, right? The big donut. The United States Congress is debating the existence of climate change. Now, there may be people in this room that actually believe that climate science is mythical and can debunk climate science. What I'll tell you from my personal perspective, there is no other political body anywhere in the world that's debating climate science today. They are not debating climate science in sub-Saharan Africa. They're not debating it in China. China has a 5-year plan that they just passed a year ago, and that 5-year plan, it's very much, how do we get out of this fossil fuel mess we're in? And they're in a big mess, and they acknowledge that. And who knows if they can scale to the point where they can actually help the rest of the world solve the problem. They're not debating it in Europe. They're not debating it in Japan. They're not debating it in any other part of the world except the United States Congress. And so they debate that, and instead of passing energy policy, where we'd have a national energy plan that looks at health risks, public health risks, looks at environmental issues, and looks at climate or climate change, says, hey, take climate change off the table. Let's just think about the environment and public health. We get no energy plan out of the United States Congress. So we work with states. And you know, we have had better success in states in trying to talk about advancing sort of this idea of a clean energy economy in America, of an economy that is based upon domestic energy. So we have less and less and less of the way of importing foreign sources of energy, where we rely upon domestic energies, but we look at how we do that in an environmentally sound way, how we create jobs so that there's economic development, and how we do it with equity so that we don't build out energy plans on the backs of people. If you paid attention, that was energy, environment, economic development, and equity. We use it as a mnemonic device to talk to governors, right? Because governors don't always remember well. And so you need to give them a way to sort of think about it. They also have big egos. That could be the 50 for governors. But anyway, I was one, I can say that, right? So that's how we think about it with states. And even at the state level, we've been met with some sort of resistance in the last couple of years because this issue about energy has become seriously politicized. And especially the issue about clean energy. And you can see in the sort of presidential debate, there hasn't been a single mention in the presidential debates about climate change. There is a discussion about energy, but largely it's, you know, kind of this fight about did we spend too much on this side of the aisle, and who's better at sort of doing what we can to extract fossil fuels? There's a lot of important dimensions to this, and one of the things we do with states is to try and talk about environmentally sound extraction of natural gas, because we think that's this really important point. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of this is being debated, and not much of anything is really get decided, particularly along the lines of the 4 E's, where we really have a coherent energy policy that's environmentally sound and that creates jobs and doesn't really hurt poor or lower income people. There are states that have proved the point, Colorado being one of them, that you can actually get all those things in one way. But as we've seen, as we've moved around the country, this issue has become increasingly debated and increasingly polarizing at the state level. There are a lot of legislators elected in 2010 who say, you know, we're not going to do anything on energy that involves a mandate. Saying, well, actually the energy industry's been regulated since 1905. If you're opposed to a mandate, you're abdicating your authority in the electricity sector as a legislator or a regulator. And then there's a lot of people who say, listen, we think that environmental regulations are this place where, you know, jobs go to die, or where there's cradle for, or this graveyard for jobs. And as much as you may like or not like the EPA, as a governor, I intersected very well with the EPA. They helped us think about our energy plan. The EPA, there were 191 votes in the United States Congress last year to erode the authority of the EPA. You might say, well, you know, maybe that's just where the people of this country are about the EPA. You know, Colorado College took a poll, and they looked at voters in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, and in every state, a majority of the people who vote in those states approved of the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. They took that poll the exact same month that Congress took a vote on it. And Congress voted to take away the EPA's authority. And I mean, you know, when you look at Wyoming or Utah, this isn't, you know, some Democrats more than Republicans favor the EPA, so it's become this partisan thing. It seems that way in Congress, but out here in the West, it wasn't that way. I mean, I know a lot about Wyoming. I worked construction in Wyoming for several summers, both in high school, college, and even 1 year in law school. And I mean, you could shoot a cannon off in most places in Wyoming and not hit a Democrat. And yet, I have to tell you, the people, the voters of Wyoming favor the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And so Congress has this big disconnect from where the states are. We saw state legislators that I think got elected in 2010 who have a disconnect from where the people are, because what the people want are clean, reliable, affordable energy. You know, the same poll, the EPA poll, this was Colorado College. They used a Republican pollster and a Democratic pollster, asked, you know, all the voters in those 5 states the same questions, and the voters in, you know, Montana, a heavy coal state, Wyoming, pretty heavy coal state, Utah and Colorado, New Mexico are all 3 fossil fuel extraction states. Natural gas is actually bigger in Colorado than coal. It's bigger in New Mexico than coal. But still, I mean, these are, and they asked, they said, what do you want next on the grid? And they said, we want clean energy. They said, would you pay more for it? They said, yeah, we'd pay more for it. Now, they wouldn't pay all that much more if they're poorer people. So it broke down, not along partisan lines, it broke down, and this makes sense, right, along income lines. The more money you make, the more you'd pay for clean energy if it could be the next thing on the grid. The less money you make, the less you would pay. But everybody, the voters, majority of the voters said, absolutely, we'd pay more for it. We like sun best, wind second, gas third, oil fourth, and coal fifth. And these are in serious coal-producing states. So this is the context, right, that we have in this country, where we have sort of this political disconnect at the federal and the state level. And the governments that exist closest to the voter, local government, are the governmental entity that probably will have to do the most to think about those ways that we can be most innovative and on scales that cities can appreciate, right? We have a municipal utility here in Fort Collins. And then that municipal utility has served the city extremely well for a very long time. But even in places where there's not municipal utilities, the city is a customer of the utility. And you saw sort of this food fight between Boulder and Excel. And Boulder, has voted to approach municipalization. We'll see if they do that or not. It was interesting for me because as a governor, one of my best partners in moving forward our new energy economy was, in fact, the major utility in this state, the investor-owned utility, Xcel Energy. And not that they're perfect, and not that I was by any shakes perfect, but the fact of the matter is we moved a pretty aggressive agenda, and we did most of it with Xcel helping advance the agenda. I would tell you that's unusual. There was probably no other place in America where the governor had the kind of relationship with the CEO of the utility that I did, and where we were actually changing things. You can have a great change. Utilities are not great agents of change, right? They are not the people that are going to be out sort of on the vanguard, because their history is they've been told what to do, especially investor-owned utilities, told what to do for this period of time to get this rate of return. They're regulated by public utilities commissions. We happen to have a CEO at Xcel when I was governor who was very enlightened, and I consider one of the great leaders in the utility world, Dick Kelly. And we were able to manage this. But you see, municipalities, even where you're not your own utility, you're still a customer. And the fact that you are a customer matters a great deal to the utility. And so to demand certain things from them is a really important thing. Now, from this, so let's understand again that you can do policy at the state level. Currently, it's very difficult to do any kind of policy at the federal level, and so it's important for cities to be a part of thinking about how we change the way we produce and consume energy to get to a place where it's more in the way of reliable, affordable, clean energy. How do we get there? What's the role of cities, and what's the thing? The first thing is something I think that Brett mentioned and that you've been talking about, Bruce, which is to think about this in terms of systems. It really is interesting when something sort of new comes in. And not that it was new when I was governor in 2007, but a lot of people were thinking about energy differently sort of in the last 5 years prior to that. But they were talking about how do we build out generation differently? How do we do what's called demand-side management? How do we utilize this new thing we call the smart grid? What do we do to get demand response from the customers? See, we built utilities, we regulated them, right? We centralized their efforts, and we said the more electricity you produce for customers, the more money we'll pay you. And we did this really with a coal and gas and oil-based system in the 1900s. As we developed nuclear and got to a place of 20% of nuclear, it was still big concentrated plants, these big sort of utilities that had to, in order to sort of increase the kind of profits, increase the return to their investors, they had to think about ways to use more and more, produce more and more, and get their customers to use more. And suddenly people started saying, actually, this doesn't work if we're going to tie our energy policy to environmental policy. If we actually care about emissions and we want to reduce emissions, we're going to have to develop a model that actually says, we've got to decrease energy use. And we may even have to decrease energy use as demand grows. If you look at emissions in the United States, we're very much on track to meet some of the goals that would have been set if we had signed the Kyoto Protocol. We didn't sign it, but we're on track to meet those emissions, in part because of activity in states, in part because of flat demand, but really state policy probably has been one of the biggest drivers of our reducing emissions. There are 240 million Americans that live in a state with a renewable energy standard. We're pretty proud that Colorado has the second or third most aggressive standard. You said, you're governor, why don't you know if it's second or third? Because I was at this deal in Washington, D.C., and I was the last speaker, but the other two speakers, one from New York and one from L.A., and the guy from New York said, we have the most aggressive standard. The guy from California said, we have the most aggressive standard. So I said, we have the second most aggressive standard, we just don't know which one of you are first. So we got 240 million Americans living in a state with a renewable energy standard. It'd be the fourth largest country in the world if it were just its own country. We have 200 and some million Americans like that, 220, 230, living in a state with an energy efficiency resource standard. again, be the fourth biggest country in the world. If we just said, okay, all the states that don't have EERCs, you're out. Anybody that has an energy efficiency resource standard, you're in. New country, it'd be the fourth largest. And so we've done actually some really good work around this. But the efforts that we have done have just kind of stalled over time. If you look at what's happened in states in the last few years, there's just too little that's happened in states. And so it's important for cities to say, okay, generation, demand-side management, smart grid, demand response, let's think about this in terms of systems. And so adopt a whole new frame. It's not, that we silo generation, that we just silo demand response, that we silo smart grid management. We say, what's the framework where we can do this? And one of the important parts, I'm not going to talk as much about finance, but it is important to think about this from the perspective of how do you finance this? What are the options for financing these kinds of things in the way of systems thinking about generation? And do it in a way where we incorporate our thinking about all this. We don't silo it. We don't say, okay, you smart grid city folks, you sit over there, and you big generation people, you sit over there. We actually know a lot about, it's not like we should do away with centralized generation. There's a pretty good study out of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that says it's got to be a part of going forward. There's this renewable energy futures study that talks about us being able as a country to get to 80% penetration of renewables by 2050. People think, that sounds like pie in the sky, 80%. With all the coal and natural gas and nuclear that we currently rely upon, really? But they did this study, and they didn't make many assumptions. They made some assumptions around transmission, but one of the things they would say is we need to keep some level of significant transmission as a part of that, because if you pick up with efficient transmission lines renewable energy from broad geographical areas, there's a great deal of balancing that you can do. They've mapped the wind in Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And people always talk about one of the downsides of wind being intermittent, but you get near 24-hour wind if you were to have a transmission line that we once called the High Plains Express that really pulled up wind from all of those 3 different states, and from the places within that states where the wind blows, you actually get this significant amount of close to 24-hour transmission. I don't think you could ever get to a place where you wouldn't call it to some extent intermittent, but you could certainly get to a place where the firming capacity needed for that intermittency was far less than you might otherwise imagine. So centralized transmission is still going to be a part of it, but so is this notion about trying to use distributed generation. Think of all of the rooftops in Fort Collins and Loveland. And what if on all those rooftops you just made a commitment to find a way to install solar systems so that they became part of the grid? Now that would take a great deal of what you call distributed generation management, but it would also utilize smart grid technology that sort of can manage these systems in a way that we didn't even think about 15 or 20 years ago, the way we didn't think about the capability of the internet, the capability of information systems to change really corporate behavior across the world. We have that ability. And so it's this mix of big generation, but demand-side management and distributed generation utilizing smart grid. That's all part of how a city should approach this notion of hopefully becoming a net zero city. There's also a core to the concept of net zero cities is also energy efficiency. And this is one of my sort of favorite stories. And they'll tell this story at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So you're working with a bunch of engineers who are renewable energy engineers, and an architect comes in to design a 220,000 square foot building. Architects, sort of have a way of thinking about that. They sort of think, okay, this is what buildings look like these days. This group of design engineers at NREL said, no, we want to think about this completely differently. We're going to think about this completely differently. We're going to design a building that is one of the most energy efficient buildings in all of the federal system. And so they just said, think outside the box. Now, I've toured this building, and the only thing I would say, it's not made for loud people like me, right? Because there aren't many offices or walls or things like that. They have ways to heat it. There's a lot of passive heating and passive lighting that helps allow a lot. And if you've got a deep voice that carries, people look at you like a bull at a bastard calf, in the middle of the day. So I just have to stay away from it. But it's this great building. They added solar to it, and they became a net zero building, producing more energy than they were actually consuming as a building. And that wasn't their original concept, but the architects, they would say, got to a place where they could think outside the box. And you know what? The kicker? The kicker is the cost of this building was pretty much close to the cost of building a traditional building in today's sort of, corporate world. If you're some other company that's not thinking about energy issues and energy efficiency issues, and you come in and you say, what's it cost to build out a square foot? This building turned out to be very similar to that. So, one of the things a city can do, and certainly a state can do this, but a city can probably do it better and faster and with greater accommodation, is to get to a place where energy efficiency is a priority for design. Like it's the first thing you think about. And we really look at NREL as this example, but builders across the country that are doing this, they really, and there's some great examples that have been around for quite a while. And so it's why that third part of this talk is so important, and it's culture. When it becomes part of the building culture, that energy efficiency is this priority, then you'll see a change in behavior. We had kind of a time with home builders when we suggested that any home in Colorado that was going to be new construction, the contractor had to offer solar as an option. You didn't have to do it. You just had to offer the option, because we have over 300 days of solar a year, and because we really believe that in Colorado the direction of solar is to be at a place where we get to grid parity with other forms of energy and with a constant energy source, right? And that it was an important thing, and also there's just this big appetite among Colorado consumers for that. And so for us, offering that said, you know what, among contractors, we're going to develop this culture in the way of thinking about it. It's interesting. I have a brother-in-law that owns a big roofing company. He's one of the second or third biggest roofing contractors in the state, and he's now one of the preferred contractors to install solar shingles. You know what the first state in the country that Dow came to with their solar shingle launch? It's Colorado. And part of that has to do with the fact that we embraced, through a lot of public policy, both at the state and local level, this advancement toward clean energy, and the other part of it is culture. And sort of the way we think about clean energy, or have begun thinking about it over the last, I would say, since the early part of the 2000s, that there is a culture here that appreciates it. So it is, for us, it is important that we have ways that really look to building out clean energy that, first of all, have a policy embrace. I think I signed 57 bills at the state level when I was governor, and we found that there was a power in public policy. But that policy embrace, imagine if you take that and you spread it across municipalities and town councils and county governments all across the state. People say, well, this may be just a northern Colorado thing. It's interesting, 2 weeks ago I was in the mountains, and Garfield County. So if you know Garfield County, it's Glenwood Springs, Rifle, and goes really to the border with Mesa County, which is Grand Junction, but one of the counties that has the most natural gas development. And for our part, we're doing everything we can with respect to natural gas and asking what role it can play in a clean energy economy, and particularly how we go about the business of extracting it in an environmentally sound way. But it's a kind of a county where you might think it's about fossil fuels. We gave this county some seed money when I was governor through this initiative called the New Energy Economy Community Initiative. We like the term New Energy Economy, right? I've got it on my center. Reporters used to have a drinking game about how many times I would say New Energy Economy during a speech. And you could see they kind of set an over-under, and somebody had to buy drinks when it was over. Somebody else had to buy drinks when I was under, and you could kind of see, he didn't get there. Yeah, he got there. During the speech, they'd be fist pumping and stuff because somebody else was buying the beer. Well, anyway, so we had this new energy economy community initiatives, and we gave some money to Garfield County, to some people there, and now they have developed sort of something that is still part of that group, but they call it Garfield Clean Energy. This is a county, a rural county in Colorado, has saved $1.8 million, $1.8 million in energy savings in their towns, their cities, and their county government offices in the last 2 years. So just in a 2-year time period, $1.8 million in a small county, because they went after energy audits. They went after every kind of energy waste that they thought was happening. They did it in all areas of government. They sort of left no stone unturned. They've got people on both sides of the political aisle convinced this is this great money saver. And, you know, for them, this was something that was sort of important because they believed in this tie between energy and the environment. They did a lot of job creation as well, because what flowed from their energy audits were ways to go in and be installing new things or retrofitting homes, looking at different appliances. And so I was part of giving a group of people and contractors awards because of the number of jobs that had been created as a result of this. This is one little county, Garfield County, on the West Slope in Colorado, that proved very much, I think, what this conference is about as well, is that you need to look for ways to develop this culture within limited geographical spaces, and people care enough when they learn enough about this issue that it'll follow. So that's policy and culture. On the finance side, I think this is really sort of the place where a lot of thought is necessary. I wasn't going to spend as much time on it, but we had a variety of ways of thinking about finance, and it became kind of tough during the downturn to look for ways to provide for financing going forward. And we had some places where we didn't get help from the federal government. The PACE program. So for those of you familiar with PACE, it says a citizen can voluntarily increase their property tax over a 20 or 30-year period. The county government that gets that property tax, they can bond against that future income, and with that bond money make installs for renewable systems or energy efficiency systems. And this was wildly popular just when it sort of started. When it first began, we said, yeah, you can do it at the county level, but you need a referendum at the county level. So we had Gunnison, Pitkin, and Eagle all put it on their ballots, all passed it. So we said, you know, those three are contiguous counties. Let's say you can do it regionally, so you can really expand upon the bonding capacity if you've got 3 counties instead of 1. And so we passed, I signed a law that said we're going to do regional PACE, and then we looked at it and said, you know what, there's an appetite all over the country for this. And there's an appetite in the state for this PACE financing, so we signed that into law. It was interesting, the first time I heard about PACE, somebody came to me and said, well, they do it in Berkeley and they do it in Boulder. And my response was, no offense to people from either, like, if you don't want to get elected in Colorado, then mention Berkeley and Boulder in a sentence and say, that's why I'm doing this. So we didn't mention Berkeley and Boulder, and we had a great appetite for it, and we had statewide PACE financing, and FHA came in and said, we don't want to take a secondary position to this voluntary increase in the property tax. Now we have a bipartisan group of people in Congress that might, in the lame duck session, actually pass PACE financing and say to FHA, you will take a secondary position. This is a property tax that people still have to pay. You're already subrogated to property taxes, and it's a deal that will help us build out energy efficiency and renewable energy measures. Those are the kinds of sort of innovative things that have come up that are about financing. Our center is trying to work on how we incentivize institutional investors to be more involved in helping their consumers build out energy efficiency and renewable energy systems. And if there are people here that have ideas about how we might do that, let me know. If you have ideas about the kinds of state policies that may make a difference, let us know, because we're really trying to, again, work with states and have states think about financing as well. So I end with this by saying, so I don't think it's trite to say that the reason I'm involved in this is because I have 4 kids. And I think those 4 kids are sometime along the way going to have children, and those children are going to have children. And I am not sure there's an issue in America that is actually a bigger issue for our children and our grandchildren than this issue of how much carbon we're putting into the air. If you get to 391 parts per million, which is where we're at, you're growing at 2 parts per million per year, which is where we're at. You get over 400 million parts per 400 parts per million. You know, in the next 4 or 5 years, that's the most that's been in the atmosphere for 420,000 years. And it's a hockey stick effect. It's not just like we've incrementally climbed up. This has all happened. And I look at this and read the science, not just about sort of the solar ice or the polar ice caps, but about, you know, the rising seas, the rising temperatures. I look at sort of the failed nations of the world and think, God, there are so many other fragile places that if climate change is real, there are a lot of places that can become Somalia because we, as the most carbon-producing nation per capita, didn't address it. We, as a nation, have this big leadership role in trying to understand the relationship between carbon and climate change, and we fail to address it, then you know, we've done something which is perilous, not just to our kids and their kids and their kids, but really to the globe. And so this is this issue where we get kind of mired in details that are around the technology and around the engineering and about sort of policy specifics. But in fact, if you expand back out, this is this issue that may matter more to the people of this world than anything else we do. Thank you very much. You think about some of the best cities that are involved in this. San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio, Texas is, and Austin is sort of trying to move that way. And you'd think it would have been in reverse order because Austin's sort of the Boulder of Texas. And they're kind of out there on their own. Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon are 2 examples of city where I think the efforts have been more coordinated with state government and where the states are really supportive of the municipalities trying to move in that direction. I think the state of New York, even though, you know, you've got Andrew Cuomo and Michael Bloomberg, right, mayor and governor, and they're both big personalities. I think they're trying to work together. I think they're trying to figure out ways. I actually talk with the Deputy Secretary of Energy once in a while in Andrew Cuomo's office, and I think they're trying to really figure out ways where they can look at New York City's efforts and try and combine their efforts. Mayor Bloomberg's very focused on shutting down coal plants around the country, quite frankly, but certainly trying to make New York City more sustainable. And that's kind of a personality-based thing. And so, you know, Washington and Oregon are probably my best examples of trying to support cities. California's probably doing as good a job as anywhere as well, but by and large, in, you know, 50 states around the country, the vast majority of states have left cities more on their own than not. Like they have some estimates of investment by investment, you know, and what they didn't do in modeling it economically, they didn't talk about the job creation that happened as a result of it, too, that actually provided more for their own coffers as a result of the economic activity that was happening there. But they were looking at investments that had a 4 and 6 and 8 month payback. And some, you know, that were just amazing where it wasn't at all about investing. They had an entire horse barn, right, where people went and rode horses. And nobody usually used that from about 7 o'clock to night and, you know, 8 or 9 in the morning. And it was heated all night long. Their police station in Glenwood Springs was another example that they used where their detectives really just worked till 4 or 5 in the afternoon. They didn't have much crime at night. There was one on-call guy, but they left the lights on all night. And so some of it was kind of basic stuff that just involved some investment of time and energy in going to places and auditing practices and auditing behavior more than it was actually making some kind of a construction retrofit. Thank you again. See you.